Welcome to Digication Scholars Conversations. I'm your host, Jeff Yan. In this episode, you'll hear part 3 of my conversation with Michael Yarbrough from John Jay College of Criminal Justice. More links and information about today's conversation can be found on Digication's Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Full episodes of Digication Scholars Conversations can be found on YouTube or your favorite podcast app.
Welcome back to our conversation with Michael Yarbrough. In part 1 of this conversation, we introduced Michael Yarbrough and COVID-19 at CUNY, a class project, which his students created after the spring 2020 semester was abruptly interrupted and transitioned online. In part 2, we delved more deeply into the project, the students' experiences during such a tumultuous time, and the basis behind Michael's choices as their professor. When we finished part 2, we were talking with Michael about how the project has impacted his students' perceptions about their significant contributions to the world and how this project served to show many of them their impact, relevance, and skills.
And I think that was incredibly valuable as a learning experience for the students because it really showed them how the kinds of things they experience every day that I think often are devalued in our society or seen as kind of irrelevant, or everyone knows about that already, or not that important. But they were actually able to see, no, I actually have knowledge. I have expertise that even my professor doesn't have, right? Even he wouldn't be able to generate this question, but I can generate this because it's something I know in my life. And I think that's really important.
This is coming back in full circle, just like that happened to you as well when you were a student.
Yeah.
And I feel like that some of the things that you had said are, I hope, will be taken by the audience, and if they are in a position of being a faculty member, that they can think a lot about that, and hopefully challenge their own thinking and their own way of their own relationships with the students, and even their philosophy on it. Are you just giving them a bunch of knowledge, or do they learn how to process their lives using the experience that you provided them, the opportunity that you provided them with, and how do you make that engaging and something that they can sort of do over and over again for the rest of their lives? And I think that this is, when I looked at your students' work and I see this is what they've done, there will be other crises in their lives in the future, and when that happens, they would be able to draw from this experience and hopefully handle it better, maybe help others handle it, support figure out better ways to support other people, and that's a really worthwhile thing to have in our education system. I feel like that there should be some newer, better outcomes to describe stuff like this.
I'm hopeful. I mean, there are many things I worry about looking forward for higher education and in relation to this crisis, in terms of funding and making sure that that the students who need the resources for their education get it. But one of the things I am hopeful about is that the experience of having to adjust our teaching, for all of us to have to suddenly kind of adjust how we teach, that it might have lessons for us for how we relate to our students going forward. I think about something as simple as administering tests, for example, and how many, I think, faculty have been concerned about preventing cheating with online tests and these kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's an understandable concern. And there are many classes for which you have to have some sort of exam or some kind of assessment that gets at that knowledge. But that way of thinking about students sets up this adversarial relationship between the teacher and the student, right? So that the student's going to try to get one over on me, and so I've got to prevent that. And I really think that that kind of conception can get in the way of building the relationship that teaching really requires. I think that you've got to build a relationship of trust with your students. You have to trust them so they'll trust you. And when you do that, then you open a space of vulnerability where real learning can happen. And I'm hopeful that many people might come out of these 2, 3, 4 semesters of forced online learning, um, with an appreciation of that, at least out of necessity, just out of realizing that I couldn't just move my class online exactly as an in-person class. I had to make adjustments. And so maybe one of the things that comes out of that is an appreciation for the importance of relationship building. When we do return to lots of face-to-face teaching as well.
I I love I love what you said about the example of plagiarism. Um, I have a feeling that in your class, in your COVID-19 at CUNY class or project, not only were there zero plagiarism, but the idea of it never even came up.
Yeah, I'm hopeful that that's true, and I think that that's true. It's possible maybe someone faked an interview or something like that. You never know, but
Yeah.
I did read the transcripts, and you can usually tell when they're faked, and I don't think they were. But I think you're right that the need for it, the need for it wouldn't have crossed a student's mind because of the way that these particular assignments were designed, and nor would have been possible because it's hard to fake your own experiences.
And I think that that's really the signs of a really good class, really good teaching, and really engaged student body. When I was a student myself, and I was in an art and design school, um, the concept of plagiarism would have been ridiculous for us.
Mm, mm,
The artists are just too well. For one, we were too proud and too egotistical to even try
mm,
to. If
mm.
anyone that almost approach the kind of concept that we have in our projects, sometimes we'll just completely throw it away and just start something else instead, just to just so that we are stepping on new ground because that's
Right.
what we were all about. And so the even concept of plagiarism in those classes was almost um, well, like I said, it wasn't a concept. We never thought about it because everyone was so invested in the work.
Right. Right. I think that's absolutely the point is that if you're doing work that you're invested in for the work's sake, then real learning can happen. I think a lot of students will often relate to different classes as things that matter because they're hurdles they have to clear to get a degree, right? So there's a function that it's performing. But for students, it's kind of a box to check, right? I've got to finish this class to get to the end of the major or what have you. And for faculty, that can be frustrating. We can say, but our subject is so interesting. Why do you not care about it in that way? Why do you treat my class as just a requirement? Um, but to me, this goes back to seeing students as human beings. And so it actually makes perfect sense that a student who's working two jobs and has family members to look after and wants a more financially secure future is going to be looking at classes as how do I get these things checked off so I get the degree that opens the path that I want in the future. It actually in some ways is rational for students to treat our classes that way, and to get them out of that mindset you have to create a different kind of class, right? You have to create a class that's valuable to the student on its own, not just as filling a requirement. And that's easier to do with some classes than others. There's certain skills are just always going to be tough and not super enjoyable to learn. But I think in every class we can find ways to make it relevant for students, um, not just topically, but the actual work.
Monica, as a student experiencing this shift in pedagogy, felt similarly.
I think, this was just one of those times where, you know, the classroom setting definitely changed, but it changed for better. And I think academics in general will always be changing and evolving. And I think this class project was something huge, not only for ourselves on a personal level, but on an academic level. It taught us to change differently and with no guidelines in essence, because it was something that we were all trying, you know, and just going with it and hoping for the best.
Yeah. In so many ways, I really do feel like that you all as a group sort of somehow in a in of course in such a difficult time, but captured lightning in the bottle somehow. This is it. This is the artifact.
School, and I think that's what this website represents, is that the work itself was valuable to students, and so that got them invested.
Yeah. Mhm.
It wasn't
And
just
when they do that, there's why would they take their own joy away
right,
by copying someone else's work? That's
right,
that's the point of it,
that's
doing
right.
it.
Indeed, multiple students volunteered their time to publish the project over the summer, which shows how invested they were in their work and its impact, both personally and in the community.
So the semester ended, and Professor Yarbrough emailed the class afterwards and said, is there anybody who would be interested in working on publishing all this information? And I was one of the first ones to say, I'm definitely interested. And during that time, I had lost somebody really, really important to me, which was my grandma. And I was going through a really tough time, um, like grasping everything, not being, she actually didn't live here. She lived in El Salvador. So I wasn't able to travel. I wasn't able to attend her funeral. And these were things that really um, were bringing my, I don't know how to explain it. I was just in a really I guess emotional and sensitive time. And I needed to get out of this funk that I was in. And I was like, I just I knew I needed to do something with it because I was definitely intrigued and interested, and I wanted to bring that information out to everyone else. And then I remember, it was only four of us that ended up being interested in finishing off, publishing a web page, or I mean a portfolio, and bringing out all this information. And honestly, for me, I think the project served as closure emotionally with this tough time, not being able to, go through the grieving process the way I wanted to. Also, having to understand that I didn't graduate how I wanted to. I didn't get that, that moment that everybody, expects and wants to happen. So I think this was the best way to kind of find my closure with this time. Um, and so when we actually got started, it was like a lot because we didn't even realize how much information we had and how much we had to go through and say this is not necessary and this is necessary. That was a long process, and kind of coding through and finding the codes and seeing what was really rich and what when you read you feel, and how to really highlight the moments where people were really going through tough times, but this was what was really happening. It wasn't just what the news was saying. It's like this is seriously happening in somebody's life, and this is how our CUNY community was impacted. You know, so I think that was my experience with the whole situation of finishing off the project. And I remember everybody else just wanting to continue it because it was important.
Sally also recalled her commitment to finishing the project, how she felt the importance of what they were accomplishing together.
Four of us and Professor Yarbrough, who stayed and worked on it over the summer.
And what drove you to do that? I mean, you already got your diploma. You don't need to do this.
We wanted to we wanted to create something that other people could see and other people could learn from, and make a mark in whatever was going on.
In addition to discussing this project, we took time to learn more about Michael's work and research, which is also relevant to and inclusive of a larger community.
I've read a little bit more of your bio, and you do so many interesting things. And I know that today we want to focus mostly on this course and the outcome of this beautiful project and your students. Um, I do think that based on some of the other work that you've done, you are one of the authors of of this beautiful three-part series book.
Mm.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about that? And I want to use it as an opportunity to not only, learn more about your background, but also um, use it as an opportunity to talk about other issues that our students also face today,
Mm. Mm.
because COVID isn't the only one. Um, I mean, in 2020, especially, I feel like it's been one after the other. We can't even count all of them. Um, so I feel like that by talking a little bit about your research and your
Mhm.
books, it allows us to use it as a window to see how might we look at other issues and what other issues we should be, thinking about.
Sure. So my research in general is about how law shapes the way we experience relationships in our own daily lives, and I'm particularly interested in the relationship of marriage and family more generally. Um, and this also comes out of my background. I'm adopted, and so I have a kind of interest in how people come to see each other as family, and who counts and who doesn't count as family, and these kinds of things. And this is a question that has a lot of relevance for how we handle crises when they arrive, because it's often family who we depend on in the first instance to help provide support in a crisis like COVID. And so that makes a difference for people who are accepted by the families that they're part of and those who are not, right, who don't have that family support to rely on. My own research has been focused on South Africa, on different communities that are now able to legally marry who couldn't about 20 years ago, which includes same-sex couples, so people who identify as LGBTIQ, and also in that particular project, people who live in indigenous African communities, which under apartheid law, their marriages were not recognized by the state. You had to also get married in a Christian church or in the state government. And so this interest in marriage, as you might imagine, overlaps a lot with a more general interest in LGBTQ politics, coming from my own experience as a gay and queer person. Um, and the 3 volumes that you mentioned were 3 edited volumes that came out of a conference I co-organized with Angela Jones, the friend and colleague you mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, through an organization called CLAGS, the Center for LGBTQ Studies, which is at CUNY. And the conference and the volumes were both about with marriage equality coming to the United States in the 2015 Obergefell decision. What would this mean for LGBTQ communities and politics and families after this became law? And in that project, we particularly wanted to emphasize voices of both scholars and activists working in a range of different communities of color, immigrant communities, trans communities, and so forth. What they thought the implications of this ruling would be or not be for their communities going forward. That project, thus, it comes out of a similar sort of philosophy as my teaching. And even my work in South Africa, although in a different way, comes out of the same philosophy, which is that I've come to see it as my life's mission to do what I can to help bring more people into the production of knowledge that's recognized as such from a wide range of communities, in particular from communities that have historically not been included in producing that knowledge. And so the 3 volumes it's called the After Marriage Equality series, and the volumes, they focus on that and include not just kind of social science research on these topics, but also the experiences of and interviews with some of the activists who are working on this kind of stuff on the ground. This is an issue. LGBTQ issues are very important to many students today. I think actually LGBTQ politics in the United States is a great example of the role that higher education can play for good in society at large. I think that the rise of people identifying in a range of ways in terms of sexual and gender identity is something that's been helped in part through the growth of LGBT studies within the higher education, providing spaces for generations of students like myself to connect who we are to scholarly inquiry. And then as we've gotten older, as we've become middle-aged teachers ourselves, we then take that on to the next generation. And I think more generally, what that speaks to is inequality and diversity and how much that matters to this rising generation of students, the most diverse in US history, and diverse in ways that exceed even the kind of conventional categories we're used to thinking of. So not just race by itself or gender by itself, but the intersections between those things. The same way in my own story, being gay and working class intersected to make me have to leave college for 4 years and then go back. Many of my students have similar kinds of struggles they face. It might not exactly be about LGBT identity, it might be about disability combined with, say, being a person of color or something like that. And I think our students, this rising generation of students, they understand this in their bones through experience. And I think what higher education and the classroom provides is a language to kind of translate those personal experiences into something of broader societal significance. And I believe we're already seeing the impact of that in the United States. I think the youth are going to save us. I'm convinced of this. I think that the students in my classroom are also the youth who are in the streets for Black Lives Matter protests and so forth, who are voting in record numbers in the election that's happening right now. I really believe and have a lot of faith in them, and honestly, it's an incredible privilege to get to work with them in this way. It's my source of hope in difficult times.
I think that by the time this podcast comes out, I think it will be post-election. We have no idea whether it will be post-results. We will
Hopefully.
we will only hope that really a record number of people will vote, and we can get some changes into our current political landscapes. It's scary, some of the things, like the current Supreme Court makeup, creates a lot of potentially really difficult things, including gay marriage.
Yeah.
And I think you're right that this generation of students are the ones that are going to they have a lot of insights as themselves, growing up in a generation where many more issues are being discussed more openly and more in more accepted ways. Even we just heard from the Pope, right?
Right.
By the way, isn't that crazy that didn't even make like top news?
This is where
that was like in like the third page.
Right.
Even the Pope had recognized, same-sex marriage, and yet we are still potentially having to fight this in our own justice system. But I do think that it is going to be this generation that that will create the sort of that will force the opportunity to have to happen, because it's people don't just get silenced, certainly not in a democracy, and we can only hope that, just so everyone knows, it is November 2nd today,
That's right.
the day before the election that we're recording this. And so I hope that by the time this comes out, maybe we can have another conversation to celebrate, hopefully. But regardless, I mean, I look at it in a very much longer term, is that there are still, regardless of the outcome of this election, there are clearly enough people in this country and around the world, really. But even if we just look at this country in the United States, that that have views that are very strongly opposed to the types of ideals that we just talked about,
Mm.
um, and and that's not one person, and it's not just a handful of politicians or 100 or 300 people in various parts of Congress and government. Um, it's a lot more than that, and so these issues not going to go away. It's something that we need to equip clearly our students for generations to come to have the ability to think critically about these things and play a big part.
I think that's right. The field that I teach in, and that's my home field of law and society, one of the core lessons of our field is exactly the thing that you're saying, which is that the law part's only half of the part. There's the society part as well, right? And so courts will rule. Historically, courts have not necessarily ruled in ways that include more people or that favor those who are marginalized. In fact, historically, they tend to favor the powerful. And so while it is very worrying, the direction that the court is taking right now, there still is also tons of historical evidence that we should still have hope, because people react to the court. They don't stay passive. They don't, they do react. They take action, and that's something that I've really tried to teach my students, and that I think they teach me also with their own work.
Well, with that, that's a beautiful way to wrap up for today's conversation, I think, and I hope, Michael, that we get to touch base again for your future projects, and hopefully we will be able to keep in touch. And I'd love to continue to see how things go in the following semesters as you react to whatever that comes next.
That sounds great. Well, thanks so much.
Well, lovely. We will talk to you soon, I hope.
Great.
Take care.
You too.
Digication Scholars Conversations is brought to you by Digication, a technology platform powering the most innovative ePortfolio programs in K-12 and higher education. Our website can be found at digication.com. This episode was produced by Drew Albanesius and Jessica Chittum. Thanks for listening.